A secluded, wrought-iron-gated Victorian estate bordering an ancient 1700s graveyard in Massachusetts. There are predators in this world that do not hunt in the forests or the deep oceans. They hunt where we bury our loved ones. In ancient Middle Eastern lore, they are called ghouls, demonic entities that dwell in the forgotten corners of cemeteries, surviving on the rotting flesh of the dead. But when the graves run dry, or when they catch the scent of fresh, living blood, they crawl out of the dirt. My name is Chloe. I always thought monsters were just stories meant to scare children. Until my father-in-law brought one home. It was late October in Massachusetts. The air was biting, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. My husband, Ryan, and I had recently moved into his family's ancestral home, a massive, brooding Victorian manor known as Blackwood. Ryan's mother had passed away 6 months prior, and his father, Nolan, was consumed by a quiet, suffocating grief. Blackwood Manor shared its backyard with the Blackwood Township Cemetery, a sprawling, ancient burial ground filled with crumbling slate tombstones dating back to the Salem witch trials. Every night, like clockwork, Nolan would walk through the rusted iron gates of the cemetery to leave a single red rose on his wife's grave. It was a tragic, harmless ritual. Until the night of the lunar eclipse. Nolan had gone out into the freezing rain. As he knelt by the marble headstone, his hand slipped, catching on the sharp, jagged edge of a broken memorial vase. A deep gash tore across his palm. The blood, hot, crimson, and thick, spilled directly onto the porous, rain-soaked earth of the graveyard. Nolan cursed, wrapping his bleeding hand in his handkerchief, and hurried back toward the warmth of the manor. He didn't notice the earth shifting behind him. He didn't see the pale, elongated fingers, caked in centuries of grave dirt, clawing their way out from beneath a sunken mausoleum. A creature had smelled the fresh blood. And a ghoul never forgets the scent of its next meal. The terror began subtly. The morning after the incident, I walked into the kitchen to prepare breakfast. The heavy oak door leading to the basement was scratched. Deep, splintering gouges marred the wood, starting from the bottom and dragging upward, as if something with massive, unclipped fingernails had been testing the locks. "Ryan, did a stray dog get into the house?" I asked, running my fingers over the ruined wood. Ryan frowned, inspecting the damage. "That's impossible, Chloe. The security system was armed all night. But the scratches were only the beginning." That evening, I went to the refrigerator to pull out a package of raw steaks I had bought from the butcher. The plastic wrap was torn to shreds. The meat was completely gone. But it hadn't been cooked or dragged away. The styrofoam tray was left on the shelf, covered in a thick, black, viscous saliva that smelled overwhelmingly of sulfur, rotting cabbage, and decay. I gagged, slamming the refrigerator door shut. I told myself it was raccoons. I told myself it was a prank. Your mind will build a fortress of rational lies to protect you from an irrational truth. But that night, at 3 a.m., the fortress collapsed. I woke up to the sound of heavy, wet footsteps pacing on the roof of the manor. Thump, squish, thump, squish. It sounded like someone walking on hands and feet, dragging a bloated, heavy stomach across the shingles. I nudged Ryan awake. "Someone is on the roof," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ryan grabbed his heavy Maglite flashlight and his baseball bat. We crept out into the second-floor hallway. The temperature in the house had plummeted so severely that I could see our breath pluming in the dark. We looked out the grand bay window at the end of the hall, peering out into the torrential rain. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the front lawn. Standing on the hood of our SUV, crouched on all fours like a gargoyle, was a woman. She was wearing a tattered, filth-covered white burial shroud. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess of black weeds. But it was her face that made me scream. Her skin was a translucent, bruised gray. Her eyes were completely white, devoid of pupils, bulging out of her sunken skull. And her mouth was smeared with dried blood, her jaw unhinged in a grotesque, impossible smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. She was staring directly up at our window. Staring directly at me. The lightning flashed again, and the driveway was empty. There were only deep, muddy indentations on the hood of the car. We called the local police. 2 deputies searched the grounds with K-9 units. The dogs made it exactly 10 feet toward the cemetery gates before they tucked their tails, whimpered, and absolutely refused to go any further. Animals know when they are in the presence of an apex predator. The police wrote it off as a drifter or a junkie hallucinating in the rain. But the ghoul wasn't a drifter. She was an infiltrator. Ghouls are parasitic. They slowly drain the life force of the strongest male in the territory to prepare him for the slaughter. The next day, Nolan didn't come down for breakfast. When Ryan and I entered his master bedroom, the stench of decay hit us like a physical wall. It smelled like an open casket left in the August sun. Nolan was lying on his bed, sweating profusely, his skin a terrifying shade of jaundice yellow. The cut on his hand had turned jet black, the veins branching out from the wound looking like dark spider webs crawling up his forearm. "Dad, we need to get you to the ER right now," Ryan panicked, reaching for his father. Nolan violently swatted Ryan's hand away. His eyes were glazed, staring at the ceiling. "No. No doctors. She's taking care of me. She comes to me at night. She promised to take the pain away." "Who, Dad? Who is taking care of you?" I pleaded. "The woman in the white dress," Nolan rasped, a bloody froth bubbling at the corner of his lips. "She says my blood is sweet." I stumbled backward into the hallway, my stomach heaving. The ghoul hadn't just been outside the house. She had been inside. While we slept, this demonic graveyard hag had been standing over my father-in-law, feeding on his life force, poisoning his mind. I knew we couldn't fight this with modern medicine. I drove into town and went to the oldest Catholic parish in the county. I wasn't looking for a standard priest. I was looking for Father Alistair. Alistair was a rogue archivist, a man who had spent decades studying ancient Middle Eastern and European demonology. When I sat in his dusty, book-lined office and described the smell, the raw meat, the white eyes, and the midnight pacing, the color drained from the old man's face. "You are dealing with a gullah," Father Alistair said, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound grimoire. "A female corpse-eater. They are the most territorial and vicious of their kind. She tasted your father-in-law's blood in her graveyard. Now, she views him as her property. And she views you and your husband as obstacles. How do we kill her? A gun. A knife. I asked desperately. Human weapons will only anger her, Alistair warned, reaching into a locked cabinet. He pulled out a large, ornate glass flask filled with crystal-clear water and a heavy silver crucifix. This is consecrated water, blessed at the River Jordan. To a creature born of hellfire and rot, this water is like concentrated acid. Tonight is the 14th night of the lunar cycle, the full moon. Ghouls are ravenous on the full moon. She will not just feed on his energy tonight. She will come to consume his flesh. And if she finishes him, she will turn on you. I returned to Blackwood Manor as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and black. Ryan had barricaded the doors and bolted the windows. We dragged Nolan into the central living room, placing him on the sofa. We surrounded him with a circle of pure sea salt, as Alistair had instructed. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the power to the entire estate was violently cut. The house plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the fireplace, casting long, terrifying shadows against the walls. Then, the whispering began. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the air vents. Dozens of overlapping, scratchy voices echoing through the ductwork. Let me in, little pigs. The meat is rotting, the meat belongs to me. Ryan leveled his shotgun at the front door. Show yourself, you sick freak, he roared. The heavy mahogany front door didn't open. Instead, we heard the sound of glass shattering upstairs. She had climbed the outer brickwork like an insect and broken through the second-floor window. Thump, squish, thump, squish. The footsteps were coming down the grand staircase. Slowly. Deliberately. I uncorked the flask of Jordan water, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. I stood in front of Nolan, placing myself between the staircase and my dying father-in-law. The shadow at the top of the stairs stretched. And then, she descended. The gullah stepped into the firelight. She was no longer trying to look human. Her jaw hung open down to her collarbone, a black tongue slithering over her razor-sharp teeth. Her eyes locked onto me, glowing with an infernal, hateful intelligence. "You are in my way, bride," the gullah hissed. The voice didn't come from her mouth, it echoed directly inside my skull, making my ears ring with a high-pitched whine. Ryan didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger of the shotgun. The deafening blast echoed through the manor. The buckshot hit the gullah squarely in the chest, tearing a massive hole through her white shroud. But she didn't bleed. Dry, black dust puffed out of the wound. She didn't even flinch. The gullah let out a deafening, sonic shriek that shattered the remaining glass in the living room. She lunged forward with impossible speed, backhanding Ryan with a force that sent him flying across the room. He crashed into the oak coffee table, unconscious. "Ryan!" I screamed. The demon crawled over the furniture, ignoring the salt circle completely. Ghouls are older than modern wards, salt means nothing to them. She hovered over Nolan, opening her massive, grotesque jaw, preparing to rip his throat out. "Hey!" I screamed, stepping forward and raising the silver crucifix. The ghoul snapped her head toward me. She laughed, a dry, rattling sound like bones shaking in a tin can. She swiped her clawed hand, knocking the crucifix out of my grip. It clattered uselessly onto the floorboards. "Your faith is weak, little girl," the creature gurgled, lunging toward my face. She pinned me to the ground, her crushing, freezing weight paralyzing me. Her face was inches from mine. I could smell the centuries of decay, the stagnant blood, the graveyard dirt. She opened her jaws, preparing to bite down on my face. But she didn't realize that dropping the cross was exactly what I wanted her to do. It freed both of my hands. As she lowered her mouth, I brought my hands up. I had the open flask of Jordan water. I shoved the glass rim directly into her gaping, unhinged jaw and forced the holy water down her throat. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The water didn't just burn her, it ignited the demonic energy inside her. The ghoul let out a scream so agonizing and loud that my nose began to bleed. Deep, blinding white light erupted from her throat, shining out through her eyes and the cracks in her rotting skin. She scrambled backward, clawing at her own throat as her flesh began to literally boil and melt away. Thick, black smoke poured from her mouth as she convulsed violently on the Persian rug. I crawled backward, shielding my face from the intense, unnatural heat radiating from her body. "Return to the ash," I screamed, repeating Father Alistair's final instruction. "Return to the ash." With a final, explosive hiss, the ghoul's physical form collapsed inward. In a matter of seconds, the massive, terrifying creature dissolved completely, leaving nothing behind on the living room floor but a scorch mark and a large pile of dry, black graveyard dirt. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. I rushed to Ryan. He was bruised and bleeding, but he was alive. I helped him up, and we ran to Nolan. The moment the ghoul was destroyed, the black, spiderweb-like infection on Nolan's arm began to rapidly fade. His breathing steadied, the demonic poison leaving his system. We didn't call the police again. You can't explain a pile of ash and a shotgun blast to the authorities. We cleaned the mess. We burned the rug. We survived. Nolan recovered, but he never went to the Blackwood Cemetery again. We hired a groundskeeper to leave the roses from then on. We sold the manor 3 months later and moved across the country to the deserts of Arizona, as far away from the damp, colonial soil of Massachusetts as we could get. But sometimes, when the desert air grows uncharacteristically cold, and the coyotes stop howling in the distance, I check the locks on the doors. I check the meat in the freezer. Because I know that if one drop of blood falls on the wrong patch of earth, the dead will always wake up hungry. Crimson Falls, a gloomy, perpetually overcast logging town hidden deep in the evergreen forests of Washington state. Fear is a funny thing. Most people are afraid of what hides in the dark. But my best friend, Riley, wasn't just afraid of the dark, she was terrified of what the dark was hiding. Since she was a little girl, Riley suffered from severe nyctophobia and the unshakable, paralyzing paranoia that something was always watching her from the shadows. She slept with every light on in her house. She never went out after sundown. Her parents and I thought it was just a severe psychological anxiety disorder. We didn't know that her paranoia wasn't a delusion. It was a survival instinct. Because something was watching her. And it had been waiting a very, very long time. My name is Megan. The nightmare that destroyed Riley's family began on a freezing October night in Crimson Falls, Washington. Riley was driving back from a late study session at the community college. She was taking the Old Mill Road, a desolate, unlit stretch of highway that cut straight through the dense, towering evergreen forest. Halfway through the drive, her car engine sputtered, violently choked, and died. Riley was stranded. No streetlights. No cell service. Just the suffocating blackness of the woods pressing in against the windows of her car. She locked the doors, sobbing, having a full-blown panic attack. She told me later that she felt the temperature inside the car plummet until her breath plumed in white clouds. She felt the familiar, terrifying sensation of being watched. But then, out of the torrential rain, a man appeared. He didn't look like a mechanic or a stranded motorist. He looked like he had stepped out of a vintage magazine. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark wool trench coat, with striking, pale features and eyes so dark they looked like polished obsidian. He tapped on her window. "You look terrified," he said, his voice smooth, hypnotic, and carrying a strange, almost archaic rhythm. "My name is Thomas. Let me help you." Logically, Riley should have been terrified of a strange man in the woods at midnight. But she opened the door. She said the moment Thomas looked at her, her lifelong, crippling fear of the dark completely vanished. It was as if he had reached into her mind and simply turned off the switch that controlled her terror. He drove her safely home in his immaculate, classic black sedan. And just like that, the whirlwind began. Within 2 weeks, Riley and Thomas were inseparable. Thomas claimed to be the heir to a forgotten mining fortune, living in a restored, isolated mansion on the edge of town. Riley's parents were thrilled. Their daughter, who used to cry if a light bulb burned out, was suddenly taking midnight walks by the lake and staying out until 3 a.m. But I saw the red flags. I saw the things love blinded them to. I noticed that Thomas never ate. Whenever we went out to diners, he would order a black coffee and simply push the mug around the table. I noticed his skin, it wasn't just pale, it had the waxy, bloodless pallor of a cadaver. And most disturbing of all, I noticed how cold it got whenever he entered a room. The ambient heat was literally sucked out of the air. "Megan, you're just being overprotective," Riley laughed when I brought up my concerns. "Thomas is perfect. For the first time in my life, the darkness doesn't scare me. Because he is the darkness, and he belongs to me." I shivered when she said that. She didn't realize the horrifying truth of her own words. He didn't belong to her. She was being groomed. She was being prepared for the harvest. The true horror of Thomas revealed itself on the week of Riley's 18th birthday. Her parents threw a massive dinner party at their home to celebrate. Among the guests was Reverend Vance, an old family friend and a retired spiritual archivist who had spent decades studying European occult history. Vance was a kind, perceptive man who had counseled Riley through her childhood night terrors. The party was joyful until Thomas walked through the front door. The moment Thomas crossed the threshold, Reverend Vance stopped mid-sentence. His face drained of all color. He dropped his champagne glass, shattering it on the hardwood floor. He stared at Thomas with a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. Thomas smiled at the Reverend, a slow, predatory stretching of his lips that didn't reach his pitch-black eyes. I have to leave," Reverend Vance stammered, physically backing away toward the door, clutching a silver cross hidden under his collar. "I have an urgent parish matter." "Riley, happy birthday. May God protect you." He practically ran to his car. It was the strangest, most unsettling exit I had ever witnessed. But the real tragedy struck the very next morning. The local sheriff found Reverend Vance dead in his study at the church. The official police report stated it was a massive heart attack followed by a wild animal breaking through the window and ravaging the body. But small towns leak secrets. The coroner's assistant was a friend of my mother's. She whispered that the Reverend's throat hadn't been torn by a wolf. It had 2 deep, jagged punctures, and his body was almost completely drained of blood. I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. I drove straight to the church before the police finished taping off the scene. I knew the Reverend kept a hidden journal in a hollowed-out floorboard under his desk. He had shown it to me once when I asked about local ghost stories. I sneaked into the study, the metallic smell of dried blood still heavy in the air, and pried up the floorboard. The leather-bound journal was there. The last entry was written frantically, the ink smeared, dated the night of Riley's birthday party. My blood ran ice cold as I read the words. "He is here. The shadow that plagued little Riley has finally taken human form." I looked into his eyes and saw centuries of slaughter. He is a strigoi, a sanguine parasite. An ancient breed of vampire that feeds not just on blood, but on the soul's vitality. He has been waiting for 18 years. He needed her to reach adulthood so her life force would be ripe. The fear he took away from her was just a sedative. He has been feeding on her slowly, night by night. On the night of the upcoming blood moon, he will consume her entirely and drag her soul into the abyss. I dropped the journal. A vampire. It sounded like madness, like a cheap movie plot. But then I remembered Riley's sudden lethargy over the past week. I remembered her wearing thick silk scarves around her neck, claiming she was fighting off a cold chill. I drove to Riley's house like a maniac, breaking every speed limit in Crimson Falls. I found Riley sitting on her bed, staring blankly at the wall. She looked terribly sick. Her skin was gray, her lips cracked and blue. The vibrant, happy girl from 2 weeks ago was gone. She looked like a terminal patient on her last days. "Riley, take off the scarf," I demanded, locking her bedroom door. "No, Megan, leave me alone," she mumbled, her voice weak and distant. "Thomas is coming for me tonight. We're going away together." forever. I grabbed her shoulders and forcefully yanked the silk scarf away from her neck. I screamed. Her neck was a mangled, bruised mess of dark purple tissue. But scattered across her jugular were dozens of small, half-healed puncture wounds. He hadn't just bitten her once. He had been using her as a human blood bag every single night, feeding on her just enough to keep her alive while the parasitic venom kept her docile and compliant. Tonight was the blood moon. Tonight, he wasn't going to leave her alive. I didn't try to reason with her. The venom had completely brainwashed her. I ran downstairs and shoved Reverend Vance's journal into Mr. Hayes's chest. I forced him to read it. I forced him to look at the photos of the bite marks. Mr. Hayes was a rugged, practical logger. He didn't believe in vampires. But he believed his daughter was dying, and he believed the man responsible was coming to the house. He unlocked his gun safe and pulled out a heavy 12-gauge shotgun. "If that freak steps onto my porch, I'm putting a hole through him," Mr. Hayes growled. I knew bullets wouldn't work. I had read the rest of the Reverend's journal. A strigoi cannot be slain by lead or iron. They are creatures of cursed blood. Only a relic of absolute, consecrated faith, bound in pure silver, can sever the demonic tie. I reached into my pocket. I had taken Reverend Vance's heavy silver rosary from his desk. It was bathed in holy water from the Vatican. It was our only hope. At exactly 11:45 p.m., the storm outside reached a fever pitch. The wind howled like a dying animal. The blood moon, a deep, rusted crimson, was visible through the breaks in the storm clouds. Then, the front door didn't just open. It was violently ripped off its steel hinges, crashing into the living room wall with the force of a bomb blast. Standing in the doorway was Thomas. But the charming, handsome facade was gone. His human disguise had melted away, revealing the apex predator beneath. His skin was pulled taut over a skeletal frame. His jaw was unhinged, dropping unnaturally low to expose 2 rows of jagged, translucent fangs dripping with a black, viscous fluid. His eyes were glowing, crimson voids. "Riley is mine," the monster hissed. The voice didn't come from his throat, it vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the glass in the windows. "I have waited 18 years for this harvest. Go to hell, Mr. Hayes roared, raising the shotgun and firing twice at point-blank range. The heavy buckshot tore into Thomas's chest, shredding his wool coat and blowing a hole through his ribs. But there was no blood. Only a cloud of dry, black dust puffed from the wound. Thomas didn't even stumble. With blinding, supernatural speed, the vampire lunged forward. He backhanded Mr. Hayes with a horrifying crack. The blow sent Riley's father flying across the room, crashing through the glass coffee table. He lay motionless on the floor, bleeding from his head. "Dad!" Riley screamed from the top of the stairs, the shock momentarily breaking through her hypnotic trance. Thomas slowly turned his gaze up the staircase, his fangs bared in a grotesque smile. "Come down, little lamb. It is time to eat." He began to glide up the stairs, his movements jerky and terrifying, like a spider scaling a web. I knew if he reached the second floor, Riley was dead. Her soul would be consumed. I had one chance. I gripped the silver rosary so tightly the beads cut into my palm. I hid behind the archway of the stairs, holding my breath, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. As Thomas passed my hiding spot, his eyes completely fixated on Riley, I lunged out from the darkness. I wrapped the heavy silver rosary directly around the vampire's throat and pulled backward with all of my body weight. The reaction was apocalyptic. The moment the consecrated silver touched his cursed flesh, the rosary sizzled like a branding iron on a hot grill. Thomas let out a screech that didn't sound earthly. It sounded like the screams of 1,000 tortured souls trapped in a burning pit. Thick, putrid black smoke erupted from his neck. He thrashed violently, his razor-sharp claws raking blindly at the air, tearing deep gashes into the wallpaper and the wooden banister. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a hydraulic press, snapping my wrist instantly. I screamed in agony, but I refused to let go of the rosary. I pulled tighter. Burn in the light. I screamed over the roaring supernatural wind that had filled the house. The holy silver burned straight through his flesh, severing his spinal cord. With a final, explosive burst of blinding white light, the Strigoi physical form collapsed. The monster didn't just die, he disintegrated. His body turned into a massive pile of black, foul-smelling ash and viscous sludge that cascaded down the carpeted stairs. I collapsed backward, clutching my broken wrist, gasping for air. The police arrived 10 minutes later, called by neighbors who heard the shotgun blasts. They found a destroyed house, a hospitalized father, and a pile of unexplainable ash on the stairs. They ruled it a home invasion by an unknown assailant who fled into the woods. Mr. Hayes survived the attack, but he walked with a cane for the rest of his life. Riley spent months in intensive physical and psychological therapy. Once the vampire was destroyed, the parasitic venom left her system, and the puncture wounds on her neck healed into pale, circular scars. She got her life back. But a piece of her innocence was burned away in that house. We moved away from the Pacific Northwest. We moved to a bright, sunny city where it rarely rains, and the forests are hundreds of miles away. Riley is doing better now. But her nyctophobia returned. The fear of the dark came back stronger than ever. She sleeps with every light on in the apartment, and she refuses to look out the window after sunset. Because she knows the truth now. She knows that monsters don't hide under the bed. They walk among us, wearing expensive suits, offering us rides in the rain, just waiting for us to grow up. Or a sprawling, isolated affluent estate in the Appalachian Mountains, situated miles away from a cursed, abandoned 18th century stone chapel. There are places in this country where the earth has gone sour. Places where history hasn't just been buried, but where it actively refuses to stay dead. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania, hidden off a forgotten logging road, sits the ruins of Blackwood Chapel. It is a crumbling, roofless stone church built in the 1700s. The locals don't go there. They say the chapel is a spiritual vacuum, a place where restless, violent souls gather in the dark. And there is only one rule: if you are foolish enough to step inside the chapel walls, you must never, under any circumstances, call out a person's name. The dead are always listening, and if they hear a name, they will follow the sound right out of the graveyard and attach themselves to the living. My name is Sarah. Last November, I broke that rule. And I brought a nightmare back into my family's life. It started as a stupid dare. My cousin, Emily, and I were taking a road trip through the mountains before heading to stay at my older sister Charlotte's new estate. Emily was a skeptic. She loved ghost hunting, or at least the aesthetic of it. She parked her Jeep at the edge of the woods, and we hiked 2 miles through the dense, freezing fog until the jagged stone arches of Blackwood Chapel loomed out of the mist like broken teeth. The air inside the chapel was instantly suffocating. It smelled of ozone, wet ash, and dried lavender. "This is incredible," Emily whispered, snapping photos with her flash, the blinding white light illuminating the dark, moss-covered altar. I felt a sudden, crushing weight on my chest. A severe drop in temperature made my teeth chatter. I wanted to leave immediately. I turned around, but the fog had rolled in so thickly I couldn't see Emily through the stone pillars. Panic seized my throat. I forgot the local warnings. I forgot the golden rule of the cursed ground. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing violently off the ancient stone. "Emily, where are you?" The moment her name left my lips, the wind completely died. Absolute, dead silence fell over the woods. And then, from the darkest corner of the ruined altar, I heard the unmistakable sound of a woman weeping. A wet, agonizing sobbing that sent a jolt of pure ice down my spine. Emily grabbed my arm from behind, startling me. She looked pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We didn't wait to investigate. We ran back to the Jeep and sped away, leaving the chapel far behind us. But you can never truly leave a haunted place behind. Because when you speak in the dark follows you home. 2 days later, I arrived at my sister Charlotte's sprawling, isolated mansion. Charlotte had recently married Greg, a wealthy real estate developer. Greg was charming, but there was a coldness to him. He was a widower. His first wife, Clara, who was actually Charlotte's older sister and my own estranged sibling, had tragically taken her own life by drowning in the estate's massive lake just a year prior. It was a scandalous, horrifying family tragedy that we never spoke of. Charlotte stepping in to marry her dead sister's grieving husband was something that deeply fractured our extended family. But I needed a place to stay for the winter, and they had plenty of room. The haunting began on my very first night in the guest wing. I was sitting in bed, reading, when I asked the housekeeper, a nervous, jumpy man named Chester, to bring me a glass of ice water. 10 minutes later, I heard the door creak open. I didn't look up from my book. A pale hand set a crystal glass of water on my nightstand. "Thank you, Chester," I said. A woman's voice, wet, gargling, and filled with sorrow, whispered right into my ear. "You called, so I came." I dropped my book and scrambled backward against the headboard. There was no one in the room. But the glass of water on the nightstand wasn't filled with water. It was filled with murky, freezing lake water, thick with green algae and smelling of rotting fish. My heart hammered in my chest. I ran out into the hallway and nearly collided with Chester, who was carrying a silver tray with a fresh glass of clean ice water. "Miss Sarah, I brought your water," Chester said, looking confused at my terrified expression. I realized then that it hadn't been a hallucination. The ghost from Blackwood Chapel hadn't attached itself to Emily, even though I had called her name. The ghost had attached itself to me. But as the days turned into weeks, I would soon discover that this spirit didn't come from the chapel at all. The chapel had simply been the doorway she used to find her way back to the people who had murdered her. For the next 2 weeks, the entity relentlessly stalked the halls of the estate, but it only seemed to appear to me. I would walk past the grand mirrors in the hallway and see her standing right behind my reflection. She was a horrifying sight, a woman wearing a vintage, tattered wedding dress that was completely waterlogged. Her skin was bloated and gray, her long black hair plastered to her face with mud and pondweed. And in her arms, cradled tightly against her rotting chest, was a bundle wrapped in a filthy, wet blanket. A phantom infant. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought the curse of the chapel was driving me to madness. But the true nature of the horror revealed itself the night of Charlotte and Greg's anniversary dinner. I was in my room getting dressed when I heard a horrific, blood-curdling scream coming from the detached greenhouse in the backyard. I sprinted downstairs and ran out into the freezing night air, Greg and Charlotte right behind me. We burst through the glass doors of the greenhouse. It was a slaughterhouse. Chester, the housekeeper, was pinned to the ceiling. Thick, thorny vines from the exotic plants had wrapped around his throat and limbs, hoisting him 10 feet into the air. He was dead, his face purple and eyes bulging. But there was no physical way vines could move with that kind of speed or strength. This was dark, aggressive poltergeist activity. Charlotte collapsed to her knees, screaming hysterically. Greg was pale, his eyes darting around the greenhouse shadows like a hunted animal. What did he see? Greg muttered to himself, completely ignoring the fact that a man was dead above us. What did she show him? The police arrived, cut Chester down, and ruled it a bizarre, freak accident, claiming he must have fallen from a ladder and become tangled in the heavy reinforced trellises. But I knew the truth. I knew the ghost in the wet wedding dress was escalating. That night, unable to sleep, I crept down to the estate's library. I wanted to find old photo albums. I needed to know if the ghost I was seeing was just a random demon from the chapel, or if it had a connection to this house. I pulled out a heavy, dust-covered album from the bottom shelf. I flipped past the photos of Charlotte and Greg's wedding, going further back. My breath hitched in my throat as I stopped on a faded photograph taken 5 years ago. It was a picture of Greg and his first wife, my older sister Clara. I stared at Clara's face in the photograph, and then down at her dress. It was the exact same vintage wedding dress the ghost was wearing. The entity haunting me wasn't a random demon. It was Clara. Suddenly, the temperature in the library plummeted to freezing. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, locking me inside. The lights flickered and died. The room was illuminated only by the pale moonlight streaming through the massive windows. Squish, drag, squish, drag. The sound of wet, Heavy footsteps approached from the darkest corner of the library. Clara stepped into the moonlight. She was terrifying, her jaw slack, lake water constantly pouring from her mouth and pooling on the expensive rugs. But she didn't attack me. She slowly raised a decaying, bruised finger and pointed directly at a heavy iron safe hidden behind Greg's mahogany desk. "Look." Her voice gurgled, water spilling over her blue lips. "Look what they did to my baby." The phantom infant in her arms let out a piercing, unearthly cry. I didn't run. The fear was suddenly eclipsed by a profound, sickening realization. Clara hadn't committed suicide. Suicide victims don't return with this level of targeted, vengeful rage. She had been murdered. And I was living in a house with her killers. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The next morning, under the guise of grieving Chester's death, I convinced Charlotte and Greg to bring in Father Thomas, a renowned priest and exorcist from the diocese in Pittsburgh. I told them I felt a dark presence in the house and that a blessing would calm everyone's nerves. Greg was hesitant, but Charlotte, who was visibly deteriorating from lack of sleep and severe paranoia, begged him to agree. Father Thomas arrived that evening as a brutal Appalachian thunderstorm battered the estate. He didn't just bring holy water, he brought heavy bags of consecrated rock salt and a grim expression. The moment he stepped into the foyer, his eyes widened. "The stench of the grave is thick here," Father Thomas said, his voice grave. "This isn't a lingering spirit. This is a revenant. A soul violently ripped from its body, anchored here by an unspeakable injustice." He instructed us to gather in the center of the grand living room. He poured a thick circle of salt around us and began to chant the rite of cleansing in heavy, booming Latin. Exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus, omnis satanica potestas. The house violently reacted. The walls groaned as if the mansion itself was in pain. The massive crystal chandelier above us swung wildly, shattering against the ceiling and raining glass down around the salt circle. The heavy double doors of the living room blew open. Clara floated into the room. The spiritual pressure was so immense that Greg fell to his knees, clutching his chest. But Clara didn't look at me. She didn't look at the priest. She glided directly toward her own sister, Charlotte. "In the name of Christ, I command you to halt." Father Thomas roared, holding up a silver crucifix. But Clara wasn't there to possess a stranger. She bypassed the holy barrier entirely, plunging her spectral, rotting hands straight into Charlotte's chest. Charlotte let out a scream that sounded like tearing metal. Her body arched violently backward, her spine bending at an impossible angle. When she opened her eyes, they were no longer her own. They were completely milk-white. The ghost of Clara had possessed the body of her sister. Greg. Charlotte's mouth moved, but the voice that came out was Clara's, wet, hollow, and echoing with the chill of the lake. "Tell them, Greg. Tell them why I'm so cold. Stop it. Shut up." Greg screamed, crawling backward, tears streaming down his face. "You're dead. We made sure you were dead. Confess." Father Thomas bellowed over the roaring wind, realizing that the entity wasn't demanding blood, it was demanding the truth. "Confess your sins, or she will drag you both to hell tonight." Charlotte's possessed body lurched forward, grabbing Greg by the throat with impossible, supernatural strength, lifting his 200-pound frame off the floor with one hand. "Tell them what you did when I refused the divorce." Clara's voice roared through the room. "Tell them what you did when I told you I was pregnant with your heir." Greg, choking, his face turning violet, finally broke. "We drowned you," he sobbed, spitting blood. "Charlotte and I, we wanted the estate. We wanted to be together. We took you out on the boat in the middle of the night, we tied cinder blocks to your ankles and threw you in. Chester helped us write the suicide note. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The moment the confession left his lips, the oppressive, freezing pressure in the room vanished. Charlotte's eyes snapped back to their normal color. Clara's spirit violently ejected itself from her sister's body. Charlotte collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, vomiting up pints of dark, foul-smelling lake water. The spectral form of Clara materialized one last time in the center of the room. She looked at me, no longer terrifying, but profoundly sad. The phantom infant in her arms was quiet. She gave me a slow, sorrowful nod. And then, she dissolved into a mist of glowing white light, drifting up through the shattered ceiling, finally finding her peace. Father Thomas had recorded the entire exorcism on his pocket dictaphone. He handed the tape directly to the state police. Greg and Charlotte were arrested that very night. Detectives dragged the deepest part of the estate's lake and found Clara's skeletal remains, her legs still chained to the heavy concrete cinder blocks. The forensic evidence corroborated the confession perfectly. Greg and my sister were sentenced to life in maximum security without the possibility of parole. I left Pennsylvania and never looked back. I tried to forget the crumbling ruins of Blackwood Chapel and the horrors of that winter. But there are some lessons you can never unlearn. The dead don't hate the living because they are envious. They hate the living because we have the power to hide our sins, while they are forced to rot with them. And if you ever find yourself walking past an abandoned graveyard in the dead of night, and you feel the sudden urge to call out a friend's name in the dark, bite your tongue. Keep walking. Because the dead are always listening. And they are always looking for a ride home.